Welcome to the Moxie OT podcast, where we invite occupational therapy practitioners, consumers, and friends of OT to talk about evidence-based practice. Today we'll be talking to Karen Dilfer about the Get Permission approach to pediatric feeding. Karen is an occupational therapist and the founder of Eat with Karen, an in-home occupational therapy service that works with families and children who are experiencing mealtime challenges. She is also a founding member of the Chicago Feeding Group, a nonprofit organization that seeks to support parents and professionals who work with children who struggle to eat. Karen is well known in this area of practice, and I'm looking forward to learning more about the topic today. Let's meet Karen. Today on the Moxie OT podcast, we'll be talking with Karen Dilfer about OT's role in feeding and the Get Permission approach to pediatric feeding. Karen is an occupational therapist and feeding specialist. Her work has been highlighted on the podcast before when my sister-in-law Rachel shared her story of working with Karen. Karen's reputation precedes her in the feeding world, and I'm so excited to host her here today. Thanks so much for joining us on the Moxie OT podcast.
Sarah, it's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to talk to you all today.
Oh, I'm just so excited that you were willing to do this with us. As I mentioned before, you're a feeding expert. Can you tell us a little bit more about your background and how you gained your expertise in feeding?
Yeah, that's a great story. So I have been a pediatric occupational therapist for my entire career. And I was always just interested in feeding and eating. I think in part just because I was brought up in a family that loved food. I loved cooking. My parents and my grandparents always involved me in cooking projects when I was little. So I just had this love of food as part of who I am. And I remember being in graduate school and doing field work and just always thinking that pediatric feeding was something that was really, really interesting to me. And, I think part of what makes it so interesting to me is that eating and feeding is just part of the human experience.
Yes.
Everybody eats. It's something that we all have in common. And if you can't do it, or if it's hard, it just seemed like such a huge part of life was missing.
Absolutely.
So I just got really interested. It's like, what would it be like if you didn't enjoy eating? Or what would it be like if you couldn't eat? Or I had so much compassion for parents who were struggling to feed their kids. So I had an interest that just spanned over a number of years. And I began my career working at the Pathway Center, which is an outpatient clinic in Glenview, Illinois.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the privilege of working with a number of really talented therapists who just let me sit in on their sessions. And I learned some introductory skills, and I learned that I really, really loved feeding and I wanted to learn more. And I happened to hear a seminar by Marcia Dunn-Klein. She's a person who authored the Get Permission approach. And she came to my office where I was working and she gave a CE class, continuing education class. And because our office was hosting it, I got to be the person who got to pick her up from the hotel and buy her lunch.
Oh, nice.
And while she was there, we were eating lunch together, and she was telling me all about how her son, who was a physical therapist, had just completed his a fellowship. And I think it was in sports medicine. And she was saying that, pediatric feeding is such an important topic. And it's so complicated. And, I've dedicated my life's work to this. What I really want to do is take on a number of different people who can study with me and do fellowships so that they can learn this advanced skill. And there will be more people in the world, to carry on my work. And I said, wow, that's fascinating. I'd love to learn more. And I expressed interest about, maybe doing one with her, coming to Arizona. That's an important piece of the story. I was living in Chicago at the time. Marcia is from Tucson, Arizona. And, Marcia was really sweet. And she said, Karen, it's great that you're interested in this, but we're really looking for someone who's right out of graduate school, probably someone in Arizona. And she sort of said, you're not the right person.
Oh, no.
And a number of months passed, and I had a couple different life things happen. And the more I thought about this, the more I thought, oh, this is what I really want to do. So I called and I emailed and I called and I emailed. And then one day, I think it was like 4 or 5 months later, Marcia called me back and she said, okay, if you're going to do this, you'd have to move to Arizona. Do you want to move to Arizona? And I said, yeah, I think I can make that happen.
Wow.
So I put all of my possessions that I could fit in my small city car, and my good friend and I drove 30 hours to Tucson, Arizona. We drove across the country. I dropped her off in Phoenix and she flew back to Chicago. And that was the beginning of my year studying with Marcia Dunn Klein. So that is how I got to the place of learning about pediatric feeding.
Thank you so much for sharing that story. And this is a theme that comes up a lot on our podcast. And I think we have some episodes that'll be released in the fall that'll really speak to this as well. But, that power of mentorship is so important. And it really, we need to support each other to develop our skills. And I love that Marcia Dunn Klein decided to offer this fellowship. It's something that is becoming a little bit more popular in OT. And what a great opportunity for OTs to really be able to serve the needs of our clients. So, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, please, you go.
I was going to say, there's lots of different ways to learn advanced skills, but I can't tell you how just valuable it was for me to be actually with Marcia, to watch her treat, to try things and have her there next to me and to like help me out in the moment. I feel like that sort of learning was just exactly what I needed. And I guess part of the reason I bring that up is because, I've spent we've all sort of spent the last year in isolation, doing a lot of like telehealth and maybe like computer learning and webinars and those sorts of things. And those are good for like lots of reasons. But I really think that, spending time with a therapist that really knows their craft and is a kind and supportive person is just such a valuable experience.
Yeah, that's so great. I think that is important. We don't expect our clients really to learn we don't just give them a handout and say, well, this is how you do it, right? Yeah. We expect them to learn by doing and practicing and getting feedback from us. And that's the same way that we learn. And so we need to put ourselves out there for those opportunities. I think that can be difficult when we have practiced for a little while and, we're supposed to be somewhat of an expert in something, and to open ourselves up for feedback from other clinicians can be difficult. And also, I think it speaks to the power of persistence, and that you really let Marcia know that this is really important to you. And so she knew that you were going to be committed to this experience.
Yeah.
That's so great. So, you and Marcia have used the get permission feeding approach. How is this different from other feeding approaches?
Oh, that's such a good question. I could talk about this for a long time. So, I think the way that I've come to understand it is there's lots of different ways to solve a problem, right? And maybe in OT, you think about the idea, like there's lots of different frames of references, right? There's different ways that you can think about solving a problem. And so when we think about pediatric feeding disorder or working with kids who struggle to eat, there's lots of different groups of people in the world who think about feeding and are supporting kids through their feeding challenges using different interventions. And I think the way I have kind of come to understand it is that, in like very general, right, is that there's one group of people in the world that really thinks that we can use external motivators paired with behavioral reinforcement to get kids to eat. And then there's a whole other group of people in the world that say, wait a minute, eating is something that at its heart is an internally motivated activity. So we need to do our best to support kids' systems, physiologically, anatomically. We need to think about development. And then we need to do our best to help kids tap into that internal motivation and desire to eat. So Marcia is one of the people who was the pioneer in that camp of folks. And, the get permission approach is really an approach that says, okay, if a child isn't eating, we need to figure out why that's the case, because kids should want to eat, right? We as people should want to eat. Eating should feel good, and it should be a natural process. So if it's not happening, we need to do our best to understand why. And then we need to look for enjoyment from the child. We need to look for when that child is saying, okay, I'm ready. Or, as Marsha would say, like when the child is giving permission. And it's through looking for that interest and identifying that internal motivation. Really, what we're doing is we're helping kids eat because they want to, and they love it, and they enjoy it. And we want kids to keep coming back for more because it feels good, because it satiates their hunger. And that's really different than just using some sort of external motivator to get calories in someone's belly.
Absolutely. And I think it really speaks to OT's holistic approach and the importance that we center on client-centered interventions. And my next question on my paper, I think maybe you've hit this, but maybe if there's anything else you wanted to add, is why is it that important that we tap into those internal motivators versus those external reasons to eat?
I think that eating is something that we all do every day, multiple times a day. Like it is an activity of daily living that happens over and over and over again. And it's necessary for life. So when I meet families who have kids who struggle to eat, oftentimes those parents are either really stressed or really sad, maybe even angry sometimes, right? Because it's this problem that they're facing over and over and over again. So it's a lot of work for a parent to do all of those things to get their kid to eat. And so really, we want kids to be internally motivated eaters. We want kids to love food so they can just be independent and do it on their own, right? Because it's the way it should be. And also it's just less work for parents.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just reading actually before you came on today about the stressors that parents experience when their kids have feeding difficulties. And so I think it speaks to that importance for the whole family that these issues be addressed.
No, I mean, that's such an important thing to think about because there's such an emotional part of eating, right? When we think about typical development, parents are the ones who feed their kids first. And those early experiences are just so important for their relationship. Like feeding experiences is how bonding starts and how relationships start. So when those things don't go as planned, it can be really, really hard for parents. And so there's definitely an emotional part of pediatric feeding that feels a little bit different than other areas of just pediatric occupational practice.
Nice. That's so great that you get to be a part of that. And I think that leads to my next question. We know that there's a lot of different professionals that are addressing feeding needs. The speech language pathologists might be involved, ABA therapists might be addressing feeding, nurses. So why is it important that we as OTs address feeding?
The first thing I want to say is that oftentimes kids who have feeding challenges are complicated.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things going on. So really best practice is that we work together, right? We want to utilize the skills of our colleagues because a speech language pathologist might look at a child with a feeding challenge slightly different than me because they have a different skill set. But I'm going to tell you, I think that occupational therapists are just uniquely placed to to work with children who struggle to eat and their families for a number of reasons. The first thing is we tend to have a really holistic approach, right? You mentioned earlier that we're client-centered, and that's a little bit different than some of the other professions out there. Like we are really good at listening to parents and looking at kids and figuring out, okay, what is the thing that is really, really important to you in this situation? We're also really good at looking at all of the different parts and analyzing what makes something work, right? So we're not just looking at a child's mouth. We're not just looking at their swallowing. We're not just thinking about, introducing new foods. We're thinking about things like relationship, right? We're thinking about the emotional connection between parents and kids. We're thinking about sensory comfort and sensory integration, and how do we help kids with that part of eating, because food is such a sensory experience.
Right. Yeah.
We're thinking about mental health, right? We have mental health training. That's an amazing just asset that we bring. So, when we think about how eating is so complicated, and as occupational therapists, we bring this expertise in different parts of development, right, of participation. It feels really good to families to not just have someone look at one little piece, but to consider them as a person, as a family, as a parent. I think that we just really have a skill set that can support kids and parents who have, pediatric feeding difficulties.
Yes, thank you for sharing all that. I totally agree. When I think all the things that you've described, about how feeding is so much a part of our life and our family celebrations. And we really felt that during the pandemic, right? That we
Yeah.
weren't eating together. So being able to look at that whole picture really is our unique skill set. And I think we forget that sometimes, like it becomes so much a part of us as OTs, we forget that we're offering something really special that other professions who have really important skills that we need to collaborate with, but that's not the piece that they're bringing.
Yeah.
So kind of getting into a little bit more of the specifics, what are some of the challenges that your clients and their families face when it comes to feeding?
There's lots of things I could say to answer your question. But, some of the things I would highlight, just because this podcast is not going to be 5 hours long, is that, I think oftentimes parents feel pressure to help their kids because parents see it as their job to nourish their kids. It's a very normal and natural part of being a parent. And then I think sometimes kids feel that pressure. And when kids feel pressure, oftentimes they demonstrate resistance. And when I say that kids, I mean, it could be like toddlers up to, preschool age kids and grade school age kids and teenagers, that, autonomy and choice tends to be this thing that really can be a motivator in helping kids want to eat, right? And it makes sense because if you think about yourself, you have a lot of personal preferences when it comes to eating, right? You might really always like to put sauce on your food, or you might like things spicy, or you might like your toast extra crispy, right? So eating is this highly personal activity. And I think that when children aren't eating well, parents, are doing their best, but is they maybe become slightly more, I'm going to say this in a kind way, pushy. Kids say, oh, wow, this isn't working for me. So, I think that it is really our role as practitioners to help identify that pressure and to help eating feel good again. And in the Get Permission approach, we like to think about this concept as mealtime peace, meaning that as a first step, how do we just do some triage and make things feel good again, as best as they can for the minute, right? How do we identify pressure and eliminate it? One of the things we always say is, what would it take for this to feel better, right? What would be the one small miracle in this situation that would make things feel less terrible? So that's usually our starting place, is eliminating pressure, figuring out how we can have experiences together. And then once we're in this place of relative calm, then we can begin to do more work, explore what's going on, figure out some of those underlying pieces. But, when there's a lot of stress and a lot of emotions, it can be a really hard place to start.
I think all of those are just our natural tendencies, right? Parents want to nourish their children and help them grow. And they feel, like you said, a responsibility. Like if their child's not eating, it feels like a reflection on themselves. And then it's so natural for a kiddo of a very young age to put their, the stops on something because they want to express control over their lives. And, I love that you're giving parents permission to say, like, this is okay right now, like taking that stress off. it's already stressful having kids, and then when you have feeding difficulties in your lives.
I've learned in my practice that parents are doing the best that they can.
Yeah.
And I think a minute ago I just referred to parents as being pushy, and I mean that like in the kindest way.
Right.
And that parents are doing the best that they can, and oftentimes there's a lot of guilt or shame that I should be able to do this. And what I would want to tell parents is, I see that you're doing the best that you can, and this is not your fault. Like, this is just a really hard situation.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I think that's a great message that I think we could share with a lot of our caregivers in a lot of different situations, not just feeding. Karen, I know you've told me in the past that the get permission approach is a responsive approach. Could you talk a little bit more about what is responsive feeding?
Yeah, responsive feeding is a very broad term that comes from the area of responsive parenting. And when we're thinking about responsive approaches to feeding, what it means is that, we are paying attention to children and we're adjusting our offer, right? We know that responsive approaches consider development. They're contingent, again, meaning that we're paying attention to the communication that children are offering, right? Both verbal and nonverbal communication. And it's not a static approach, right? It means that we as adults are adjusting. We're noticing what's working for a child, and we're noticing what might be hard, and we're responding appropriately. And I think that, when we parent kids in this way, where we notice and we adjust, and when we feed kids in this way, it feels really good to both parties. And it has the potential to bring parents and kids together. So, being responsive can be a little bit tricky, because it means you have to be really good at noticing, at understanding behavior, right? What is this child trying to tell me by turning their head away, right? What is this child trying to say by throwing the food off their high chair tray? And then, we don't respond in a judgmental way. We respond with curiosity. And we respond by, maybe offering foods in a different way, maybe by ending the meal, right? There's not a clear, this is what you do, this is what you don't do. And I think that when we attempt to really understand what kids are telling us through this responsive approach, it just really has a lot of potential to help kids excel at eating and feeding.
That's so cool. And I think that really brings in all of those great OT skills that we have, right? Our observation skills, our critical analysis skills, to really think about what is happening here, not just, no, we don't eat that way, but what is the child telling us? And I think, even as OTs, as parents, we can sort of fall back into those routines that we were parented with, that we are familiar to us, but taking that responsive approach reminds us to think about what is the reasoning behind this behavior.
Yeah, and then I think the fun part, and oftentimes the really tricky part of my work as a clinician, is helping parents learn to be responsive. Helping parents learn to read their child's nonverbal communication. So then parents can really be the ones who are responsive. So we model it in our work with families, right, and then parents get to practice it when we're not around.
Yeah, that's such an important piece. We're there for 1 or 2 hours a week, maybe, but really making sure the parents get to learn those skills. Yeah. Thank you. That was a really great explanation of that approach. So when we were preparing for this podcast, when we chatted on the phone, you shared the importance of OTs seeking learning opportunities, and you shared earlier your experience seeking out learning opportunities. Can you speak to why you feel it's so important?
Yes, I mean, I think the maybe like a little bit of the background to this question is that I'm just a very curious person. And when you live your life with a lot of questions, you do things like you spend time going to the library and calling people up and asking these questions, And I think that curiosity that's just been part of my personality for years and years and years has definitely trickled over into my professional work. And, you know, there's lots of different ways to learn. And I have been the, you know, unique recipient of exceptional mentoring. That's really a topic that's close to my heart because now I've had some opportunities to mentor students, younger therapists, and it's just been a great experience for me to be on the other side and to learn. But, you know, I think that learning can take lots of forms. And one of my projects that's developed over the past couple of years is doing different webinars, teaching at universities, and really trying to educate others about the importance of occupational and pediatric feeding and the get permission approach. And I'd love to share with you a little bit about my newest project. And
yes,
Marcia Dunn Klein.
That was next on my list.
Yeah. Marcia Dunn Klein and myself and Stephanie Cohen, who is a speech language pathologist who is also a colleague. We have started the Get Permission Institute, which is an online platform that is providing training in the Get Permission approach.
Great. And so do you have an upcoming offer as well with the Institute?
Yeah, so there's a number of different live and pre-recorded seminars that are taking place. I actually think that, you know, as we're recording this podcast right now, there is a 3-day live offering going on. Marcia is giving the webinar. It's called Anxious Eaters, Anxious Mealtimes. So it's about supporting older kids who are toddlers, preschoolers, and older, who definitely feel anxiety surrounding food in meal times. So that is going to be offered as an on-demand recording that you can listen to. And there's a number of shorter offerings as well.
That's so great. And I think we are going to push this episode. We usually have quite a lag between when we record and when we release, but I think we're going to push this one out a little sooner. So maybe our guests will get to take advantage of some of those live events as well.
That's great. There's going to be live events going on all summer.
Okay, great. Yeah.
And into the fall.
We'll probably release this mid-June, so there'll be some great opportunities for our listeners to learn more about the Get Permission approach. And I know I'm excited just having this conversation with you, so I'm sure our listeners will be as well. And another important part of our episodes is always sharing a success story. And one has already been shared on our podcast when we talked to Rachel. But I'd love to hear another one of your success stories.
Wow, I'm wondering, like, what kind of story do you want me to share? Like, should it be from like a little kid? Should it be a big kid? Like, what?
You know, I always like to share is like one that made my heart go, that was like, that's a really great one. So I'm up for anything.
Okay. You know, I think the stories that I always come back to are when you work with infants who have significant medical challenges and maybe never learned to eat, or maybe never had typical eating experiences because, you know, they had heart surgery or they needed to be on a feeding tube so they could grow when they were young. And there's one family in particular who I'm thinking about, who had a little guy who was born with significant developmental challenges, all sorts of different things, you know, were going on with him. And he ended up having a feeding tube. And I think that feeding tubes are just devastating to parents because no one ever thinks their baby will have a feeding tube. No one wants a feeding tube, right? Everyone dreams about cuddling their infant. A lot of moms have really strong feelings about, you know, they really want to breastfeed or they really want to bottle feed. And, you know, feeding tubes are like never part of that vision of the future.
Never been a part of your dream about your baby.
No. And this little guy I'm thinking about, you know, he was really sick. And he got to a place where he was a little less than 2. And all of the medical issues had resolved. He was in early intervention. He was walking. He was beginning to talk. He was really interested in sports and was playing. And I would go over to this family's house, and you could just tell that things were beginning to feel like normal life. But he still had his feeding tube, in part because he just never learned to eat by mouth, right? His whole life, all of his nutrition had just been pumped into his belly because it needed to be that way. And so we worked together, myself and this mom and dad, and we decided that what we were going to do was work with this little guy's dietitian, right? Because teams are really important. We worked with his dietitian. We got the clearance from his pediatrician, and we began to slowly and systematically reduce the amount of food that he was getting through his feeding tube. And he began to eat by mouth. Wow. So over the span of like probably about maybe like 4 weeks for this little one, he went from being fully tube fed to eating by mouth.
I feel like that's so fast.
Yeah. And, we continued to work together after he was eating by mouth because there were still a lot of different pieces of eating he needed to learn. But, when I think about him, I remember that the first food that he really, really loved was peanut butter. And so I just remember it was him and myself and his mom, and we were sitting together in their kitchen, and he was in this high chair, and he was just like licking peanut butter off of his fingers because for him that taste was so good, and he was just having so much enjoyment. And I remember his mom sitting next to him and looking at him going, oh my gosh, like, I can't believe he's doing this. And I can't believe how much he likes it. And I can't believe that he keeps going back for more. And this mom and we keep in touch. And it's been about, probably 2 years or so since, we stopped working together. And now she will send me pictures of him. He's about 4, eating ice cream cones and being at the beach. And, this family really loves food. And it was really special for me to help their child learn to love food so he could share that with them.
Yeah, I think that you have a really unique and special role, and that you're helping families participate in those routines and celebrations. And it's an important way that we share with each other. And that's a really great story. Thank you so much for sharing it. So Karen, at the Moxie OT podcast, we always want to make sure we provide an opportunity for our listeners to increase their Moxie. So if a clinician wanted to start exploring OT's role in feeding, and what resource, oh my goodness, sorry, I'm going to try that one more time. So if a clinician wanted to start exploring OT's role in feeding, what resources would you recommend they check out?
Yes. So first and foremost, I would say go to the Get Permission Institute, getpermissioninstitute.com. Check out our live and pre-recorded webinars. Write us an email. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear about what you're interested in learning. We'd love for you to see what we're offering. Another project I've been a part of over the past couple of years is the Chicago Feeding Group. We're a 501c3 not-for-profit organization. We have a very, very active Facebook page, and we also have a website at chicagofeedinggroup.org. And that organization also has a number of different online offerings related to responsive feeding.
Great, thank you so much. And we'll make sure we have links to both of those options on our website. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us for this important conversation with Karen Dilfer about the Get Permission approach to pediatric feeding. One study I read when preparing for this episode explored the levels of parental stress in families with children who have feeding disorders. Levels of stress were higher on the Parenting Stress Index short form for families with children who had feeding disorders than in the control group. This included children without other comorbidities. However, stress was exacerbated by the presence of a comorbidity. These results speak to how important feeding is to the families we work with, and the importance that we address both the needs of the children and the parents as well. We'll have links to this article and all of the resources Karen discussed on our website. If you want to be a part of the conversation, leave us your email address at our website. We're on all of your favorite social media channels as well. please like and subscribe so others can join the conversation. The Moxie OT podcast was recorded in our home in the Avondale neighborhood of Chicago. This episode was produced by Brian Zira. Our intro music is courtesy of 13 Tacos Studio. Technical assistance was provided by our dog Grody. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.